Hey, Reading Lens listeners, Jason Banzoff here, producer for the Group Talk network of podcasts. Over the next few months, we're going to be releasing some of Nick's favorite episodes that he has done. And while this is going on, Nick is getting some much-deserved rest and preparing for a new season coming up. What's exciting is that this new season comes with a brand new approach to his show. Stay tuned for what's ahead. Enjoy this Reading Lens classic. Welcome to Group Talk. 4 shows, 1 podcast from the Small Group Network focusing on topics relevant to small group ministries. Whether you're in a church of 100 or 10,000, whether you're a volunteer or staff, we want to support, encourage, and equip you to lead well. So relax, listen, and enjoy Reading Lens with Nick Lenzi.
Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Reading Lens. We're so glad that you've chosen to take time to hang out with us today. I'm Nick Lenzi, and it's an honor to be your host. For those who are new, welcome. We're so excited that you've joined us. Here's how Reading Lens works. Each month I have on with us a guest who is a small group point person like myself to share with you insights from books that we're reading and what our takeaways were and how we plan to incorporate them into our lives, leadership, and small groups. I'm a big fan of today's guest, Kiersten Telzerow. Kiersten is the group's director at National Community Church in our nation's capital. In fact, she lives in Capitol Hill with her husband and 4-year-old golden doodle, Luna. Fantastic name. Kiersten, welcome to the show.
Hey, Nick, thanks so much for having me.
I actually have a golden doodle story to share with you. My in-laws live in Charlottesville and have a golden doodle named Afton, and my 3-year-old son, Marcus, has fallen in love with her to the point that anytime we see a golden doodle in Hoboken, he points and yells Afton to them. So it's adorable.
That's awesome. I mean, how could you not fall in love with golden doodles? They're sweet, they're kind, they just want to love you all the time. I personally am biased. I think they're the best kind of dogs.
Yes, they are great dogs. So some of you may have known Kiersten from the many hats that she wears around the small group network. She is like our utility fielder who's played so many positions and is sneaky good at all of them. Could you share with us what you do for the small group network?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do a couple of different things with the network. I'm very passionate about the small group network. And so you'll find me as an Accelerate speaker where we just actually today is day 2 of Accelerate Arizona. They happen all over, so you can look for one near you. But basically, they're strategic planning for your group's ministry, and they're a lot of fun. I also am a blogger, so if you see any of the Small Group Network blogs, you'll find some of my writing there, as well as right now I have a dual role. I serve as the North American Associate Director with Philip Byers, as well.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
That's awesome.
As well as the Northeast Regional Leader, because I am, in DC and then am from Pennsylvania as well. So have some Northeast connections.
That is great. I also love that, you don't just blog, you vlog. So it's always beneficial. I'm actually a secret YouTube junkie. I, of course, love all the funny videos, but I also really dig the educational ones. And there's some really good history content on YouTube. But I believe our Small Group Network YouTube page is actually pretty great, too. There's some additional content, like your vlog is hosted there. But it's also another place where you can listen to this podcast. And another thing I like about you is you actually took over for me as the regional leader, but you decided to take on even more states. I was just doing 3 of them, and you're like, give me the rest of them up there. So... And then we also have this cool connection. I'm originally from Greensburg, Pennsylvania, which is about 30 miles east of Pittsburgh. And my family went to a church in Latrobe called Telzerow Church. And years later, after we had already met through the small group network, we found out we both went to that church for a period of time. Kiersten, you want to tell them about your connection with Telzerow Church?
Yeah, so it's a great connection that we have, and I love sharing this story with people. So my family still lives there, and my dad's the executive pastor at Telzerow Church, and I grew up in that church. I accepted Christ in that church, and even received my calling into ministry in that church. So that church has a special place in my heart. But I also love the fact that anytime that we're connected in the network, Nick, that we just share that story with people. And they're like, what, really? In Greensburg, Pennsylvania?
Yeah, it's awesome. It's a great little church. I love, what your dad does is fantastic. That's actually where I found my relationship with Jesus. I grew up in that church, but it was that youth group, specifically a guy named Dan Turney, that really helped me solidify my faith and show that Jesus just isn't just something. He actually did what he said he did, and so grateful for them and what they've done for my lives. I think I usually take one moment in my year, usually when I think about it, to I'll reach out to Dan and just be like, hey, thank you. Just want to let you know, like, keep going. Your impact is far more than you can imagine. And I hope that's an encouragement for you listeners. If you have that person who helped you accept Christ, that you just text them and thank them again. I try to do it on an annual basis. Moving on. Our book today is Canoeing the Mountain by Todd Bolsinger. I'd be a bad host if I didn't ask you, do you have any good canoeing stories that I should know about?
So this is hilarious because I absolutely love the book, but canoeing does not. Canoeing and me, we don't go together. You can add camping to that list. I just generally, you will not find me canoeing in my spare time.
Yeah, because you are a Disney World girl, right?
Absolutely. I would far prefer to go to Disney over canoeing.
So I actually do have a canoeing story, believe it or not. We actually did it as like staff development back in 2013. We went portaging, which is when you like hike with a canoe. So you go from like lake to lake, and to get to the other lake, you have to like climb over this mountain. So our Canadian listeners are going to be like, oh yeah, I know what that's all about. So it'll be pretty great there. And we went through Algonquin National Park with our staff, and it was one of the best things and worst things that ever happened to us, because it nearly destroyed our staff, because we spent a week together, no cell phones, nothing. Took 12-hour drive to get there and back. So like it was quite the stress on our staff. But I think what I really enjoyed about that trip and experience is that you think with all that hiking, portaging, canoeing, and camping that you're going to physically break down first. But actually the first thing to go is your mental and emotional ability. But you learn throughout that trip that the thing that makes a difference in your day is your attitude. You know, you can choose to be miserable or you can choose to find joy. But when you choose the right attitude, you can make it through a lot of things that suck. I think that kind of leads a little bit into why he's, calling this Canoeing the Mountain, because, one of the things he's really big on is this leadership concept of, going through that pain and going through things that are uncertain. Those are the things that cause growth. So actually, let me share a little bit more details about the book Canoeing the Mountain by Todd Bolsinger. Subtitle is fantastic. I'm learning I'm actually a sucker for a good subtitle. This one is Christian Leadership in Uncharted Territory. But a little bit about Todd. Todd is currently a professor of practical theology at Fuller Theological Seminary. Prior to that, he was a pastor for 17 years in San Clemente, California, which is where a lot of this book was developed out of. Kiersten, I enjoy having our guests pick the book. What stood out to you about this book that you selected for us to unpack?
Absolutely. Well, we already cleared the air that it's not because of anything related to my love for canoeing. But we really have been doing a lot of reading as a staff in this season. And I mean, we know the saying leaders are readers, right? And so This is just one of the books that our executive leadership team has been reading. And so I always try to focus on reading, what they're reading. And I also love books that really help me develop and become a better leader. And this book literally did that. Like I grew so much in thinking about what are the areas in my life that are considered uncharted territory and in my ministry, and especially even in this season.
Yeah. I love that nugget of reading the books that they're reading and kind of understanding, what they're going through. And I feel like that's always super helpful too, because they'll pick up some lingo that they don't recognize comes from those books. And so they'll come into those meetings and they'll say one of those key words, and you have such an advantage over another staff member. Not that it is like an advantage you have to have, right? But at least like allows you to go, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. So.
Oh, exactly. And that happened several times throughout this book. And I was like, oh, that's where they got that from.
It's always a good thing when your leaders are learners. I think that's another maybe thing from this book too, of like being a learner to get through these uncharted territories. But this book does a great job of laying a foundation for approaching uncharted territory. And what they do in this book is it's broken up into 5 parts. The first one talks about understanding charted territory. And then Todd has a really distinct view of leadership, and he kind of goes into each of those as we get to that, which we're going to get to. But I think one of the things the listeners probably still asking is like, okay, so why is it called Canoeing the Mountain? And the reason it's called Canoeing the Mountain is because Todd is a really big fan of Lewis and Clark. So Lewis and Clark were explorers. We had this is in the early 1800s. Thomas Jefferson is the president. He has just purchased the Louisiana Purchase, and he is looking for these explorers to go view what he just purchased. Talk about like a blind buy, by the way. Like, we're just going to buy this land. We have no idea what's in it. That stuff to me is like beyond what I can comprehend.
Also blind in going and finding the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah. I don't know how they made it. Even reading this book, it's like, how do you know where to go? So I think one of the other things why it's like Canoeing the Mountain is that they had expected that they were going to find a river that would take them straight to the Pacific Ocean. And as they started going further west is when they hit the Rocky Mountains, not even knowing the Rocky Mountains are there. And if you've ever been to the Rocky Mountains, they are never ending. And so I can't imagine what it's like to get to one mountain, climb over it, and then see like 7 more and not even see an ocean. So that's a big part of the uncharted territory. But I also think, Kiersten, there's 2 other things that we should define for the listener. And this is one, how he defines missional, one, how he defines leadership. Would you like to take how he's kind of defining missional for us?
Yeah. So he's defining missional in the sense that it really is, an external perspective of the church doesn't exist for ourselves. And he says that in several conversations that he's had in his local church as well, where he says the church really isn't about us. The church is finding people who don't know Christ and then creating ministries and being innovative for the sake of them that don't know Christ. And then, as you talk a little bit about his definition of leadership, he really does talk about how this missional concept is shared. It's not you just going on mission for Christ. It really is this collective and communal, for lack of a better word, mission where we've been commissioned with Christ to go and do so.
Yeah. Cool. And I think the other thing that I think that's important to talk about here too is then like how Todd views leadership. And so for how he talks about this is that leadership is energizing a community of people towards their own transformation in order to accomplish a shared mission in the face of a changing world. And a big part of this is that transformation. In order to accomplish transformation, Todd uses a Venn diagram in the book to show that transformational leadership is a combination of 3 concepts. The next 3 parts of the book breaks down each concept, which is technical competence, adaptive capacity, and relational congruence. And it's when all 3 of those are combined that you have transformational leadership. And we're gonna break down each of those as we go on in this podcast. But before we get there, Kiersten, let's talk about what does the uncharted territory look like inside our own small groups? What does that look like? What that we're currently facing when it comes to our groups? Yeah,
that's a really great question. And, I think in this season, it looks like many different things. So I have a seminary degree, and Todd even says this in the book. And he was like, you'll get to a point in ministry where you'll go, the seminary didn't prepare me for any of what I'm going through right now. And that's really where I think where we're at in post-COVID is that, well, what do our small groups look like when, we're throwing around terms like I just heard this the other day that what about our phygital groups? And phygital are like physical and digital groups. And I was like, okay, that's a new word for a concept that we've been trying to explore that's been uncharted territory, because what we ended up doing at NCC is we launched an online campus. We launched our online groups. We said, let's open it up and have provide leadership and development for people all across, globally, wherever they may join from. And now we're finding, okay, so now we have a mix. We have people who have joined online, and then we have people who are wanting to meet in person again. And so what do we do when we say, okay, so we're going to, go and have a picnic at the National Mall, and someone is also chiming in from, Maine or from Italy or, whatever that looks like, because this is now a phygital group. And so that would just be one simple example of, I was not taught that in seminary. We've never had phygital groups before. And we've never even had to think through some of this stuff. Have we thought through online small groups? Absolutely. But not necessarily what if it looks like if they're, hybrid? What if it looks like if we go back to, some in-person groups? And, depending on the direction of COVID, if it gets a little bit worse, then do we go back online? And stuff like that is all literally, we are leading and building the airplane in the air as we go.
Yes. Yeah. I know for us specifically, like we were just talking about that yesterday, our we have some in-person groups that are back and they're kind of thriving, but being in the Northeast, winter is coming, and we've just been thinking like, all right, so what are we going to do once this transfers back? Because we've also seen that anytime we hold an event that's inside, our numbers just aren't great because one, it's hard to do safe. And I think people also recognize that's where a lot of that danger lies sometimes.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's definitely all uncharted. And so we were trying to think through that as a staff last night and what that looks like. One other thing I'd love to throw in right here that's kind of related. If you're still stuck trying to figure out online community, I want to encourage you to check out a new resource that we have from Small Group Network. It's actually by the online pastor at Saddleback, Jay Cranda. He has just recorded a course for us called How to Start and Sustain Healthy Online Groups. Jay's a guy I personally turn to when I have questions about online groups. He has really encouraged me to help get them started at my church several years ago. And I'm really thankful that he did, so that when COVID happened, we were ready to go. And but the thing that's awesome is Jay's just extremely knowledgeable, and he's been in this space for nearly a decade. So check that out if that's you. You can find more info at our website, smallgroupnetwork.com, and then just click on resourcing strategically and look for the course. So,
yeah, that's great.
Before we move on to the next section, anything else from uncharted territory that stood out to you that you think is worth highlighting?
Yeah. The other thing that he talks about in his book is this principle that really has become a life motto for him in, really living and adhering to the mission, is that he says we often are finding ourselves in two things. Either we adapt or we die. And he even will say, like, we go on adventure or we die moments. And basically he's talking about these urgencies of the situations that we have a choice to make. And he says that actually when given the choice, that unfortunately 90% of people will choose to die. And the statistic that he pulled that from is a study that said those who were faced with exactly that choice, to stop drinking or you'll die, to stop smoking or you'll die, to change your diet now or you'll die, the vast majority choose to risk death. And so he's just further communicating the importance of choosing adaptability, choosing the adventure that they saw the Rocky Mountains and they went anyways, as opposed to just saying, well, this mission is over.
Yeah, no, I think that's so good too. And I think that's one of those things that's really at like, I'd be shocked if all of us don't feel that inside our churches where, we know we want to go someplace new, but there's just such this resistance. And I think a lot of it's because they obviously struggle to see what's there for them. And there's that comfort, right? So even think about maybe the small group that you have that's been together for several years. It can be really hard for them to understand why it's important to multiply and create more groups because they have this thing and it works for them. And so like you can see that kind of death inside that, where a group is just, they're comfortable with what they got, and they're going to stay with that. But
yeah,
let's keep on moving. Let's dive into the technical competence section. Part 2 is all about the technical competence. So just a refresher, Todd talks about leading in a transformational way called transformational leadership, which is made up of 3 parts: technical competence, adaptive capacity, and relational congruence. So the first one is what he calls off the map skill set on technical competence. So before people will follow you off the map, gain the credibility that comes from demonstrating competence on the map. And that really starts by building trust with your people. How do you build trust with your leaders and organization?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So in DC, this takes a long time to build trust, more than I had thought. Because prior to living in DC, I lived in Georgia, and I just felt like I was here for 6 months. You build credibility and people trust you. But in DC, it took about 2 years to build relational equity with many of the leaders that I have, because it's so transient that they were just really assessing like, okay, is she going to stick around or is she going to be gone like X, Y, and Z? And they say that if you've moved, if you stay in DC and have not moved out within 2 years, you're considered a veteran. And so 5 years later, I'm still here. And so I think one of the biggest things of building trust with leaders and building trust with an organization is really I had to carve out intentional time, and I still do on a regular basis, to build relationships with the leaders as well as the staff. So it's not uncommon for me to just say, hey, this entire month I have set aside just for coffee with all of my leaders or coffee with my staff. And to be able to just continue to build those friendships and those relationships, to just let them know that I truly care about them as a person as well as a small group leader.
Yeah. What does that look like through COVID when you can't necessarily get coffee?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, so I just did it recently, and it was great. I opened it up and I offered coffee or tea via Zoom, and they were able to sign up for a specific time. And I said, typically I would love to be able to just be sitting across at a coffee shop across the table, and we would share a conversation. But we might not be able to do that right now because a lot of our coffee shops are just to go orders. I said, what we can do is just do it over Zoom. And so sign up for a time. And then I really wanted to know two things. I wanted to know, how were you feeling in terms of your group and leading this semester? But then I also wanted to know, apart from group, we don't really have to talk about groups right now if you don't want to. I just want to know how you're doing and how your family is doing.
Oh, that is fantastic. That is a great idea. One of the reasons why I think that's a great idea is you distracted them from Zoom with the coffee. So often it's like, hey, do you want to meet on Zoom? No, I don't want to meet on Zoom. I do it all day, right? It's the common thing that I think a lot of us are used to hearing. But what you were able to break that down by saying, hey, I know we can't get coffee, but why don't we do coffee on Zoom kind of thing? I like that. That's a creative way to handle that. When I think about this question too, about how I build trust, a lot of it for me comes from, I try to be as consistent as possible. I want people to know what to expect. And my lead pastor, Chris High, actually has a really good leadership lesson on this that he comes back to annually with us. But so often we strive to be constantly creative, thinking of new ways that we can, teach our leaders and communicate with them instead of just being creatively consistent. So, so many of us maybe start off with I'm going to do this weekly leadership email, and then I'm going to make it a video, and you keep trying to find the new thing to do, as opposed to just constantly communicating with them on a consistent basis being the goal inside that. And so I think that's been a really helpful thing for us. Anything else inside technical competence that we need to cover?
I don't think so, because the next section is actually my favorite in the entire book.
Yes. So let's move on to it, because man, I think this is where, if you pick up this book, this is the one where you're going to go through multiple highlighters to get through adaptive capacity. If you don't mind sharing, we were talking before the interview about how you had studied this transformational leadership kind of in college, and that you had heard two of these, but not this third one. Would you mind sharing that with the audience?
Yeah. So in transformational leadership, in college, we had talked about technical competence as well as relational congruence, but we hadn't really talked about adaptive capacity. And I guess what I would, specifically start off and define the transformational leadership is, it basically centers around the entire person of who you are leading. Because in transformational leadership, it doesn't matter necessarily what role you're doing as much as it matters about the person and how you're growing and how you're literally being transformed in the process. And I think that's why Todd really brought transformational leadership into this text, because transformational leadership is the whole in mind. And he talks about, if you go on this journey in uncharted territory, it's literally going to transform you as a person more than it's just transforming what you're doing. And so, but he does talk about adaptive capacity in the sense that he quotes Dave Gabanos. And he says, those who follow Jesus embody fluidity, adaptation, and collaboration. And so he even starts right off the bat in saying, in order to move forward, in order to get past those mountains, you've got to learn to be adaptive. You've got to learn to be flexible. He even goes in and talks about resilience. That's an essential part of having adaptive capacity. But he defines adaptive leadership is about letting go, learning as we go, and to keep going. And then he goes on to say that it's about enabling people to grow so that they can face their greatest challenges and thrive. This book is not about surviving at all. Like, it's literally about thriving and how Lewis and Clark thrived on this journey.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed that part of the book, in that, you know, he's constantly through leadership trying to take people where they might not necessarily want to be. And there's another quote in here too. It says, where he talks about, like, you're going to have to disappoint people along the way too. And so this is the quote. He says, disappointing people at the rate they can absorb. Like, I love that. Like, disappointing them at a rate they can absorb is a skill that requires nuisance. Disappointing people too much and they give up on you, stop following you, and even turn on you. Don't disappoint them enough and you'll never lead them anywhere. I love how broad his focus on leadership is. Inside adaptive capacity too, Todd gives examples to be mastered. So this might help you get caught up a little bit more on, like, what is adaptive capacity. I'm going to read a couple of these, but I'd love for us to maybe touch base on one or two that we're working on. But these are a few of them. Calmly facing the unknown, refusing quick fixes, engage others in learning and transformation necessary to take on the challenges that's before them, seeking new perspectives, asking questions that reveal competing values, gaps in values and actions, explore and confront resistance and sabotage, learn and challenge without sacrificing personal or organizational fidelity, relationally help the congregation make hard, often painful decisions to effectively fulfill their mission in challenging. Kiersten, was there one of those that you're currently working on inside your own ministry that you're trying to grow your leadership in?
That's a phenomenal question. The first one right off the bat, the calmly face the unknown, because I think our initial response as human beings is literally, I don't know what to do. I'm not sure I can do this. And it creates a lot of internal anxiety. And what he talks about throughout the book is really wrestling with that internal anxiety and, like, harnessing it. So you have control over that internal anxiety enough to then be able to communicate back to yourself, kind of how, like, we do as Christians, where we sometimes have to, like, talk to ourselves of the promises of God. He talks about doing that in such a way that you can harness the internal, anxieties, the internal stress, the internal things that will prevent you from moving forward. And then one of the things that I really enjoyed in this book as a part of the change process, he does highlight John Cotter several times, if you're familiar with the change theory, but he says it's really 4 pieces that are essential, starting with conviction. If you don't know the why of what you're doing, or the fact that you're doing it for God and what the mission that he's given you, you're really not going to make it in the long run. He also talks about staying connected. So stay connected with the people who are for you and stay connected with the people who are against you. We'll talk a little bit about this in another section.
Yeah, I'm going to earmark that because that's so good there too. Go ahead.
Yeah. And then he also talks about staying calm. And when he's referencing staying calm, he actually talks about 2 types of zones that people encounter. And this is really where, he talks about assessing the internal stressors and anxiety, as well as the external pressures and anxiety. And he says a difference between a red zone and a blue zone. So really, if you want to call it a little bit of some emotional intelligence, if you will, you have to do an assessment on yourself as well as your situation to determine the zone. So if you're in the red zone, you're pretty emotionally charged. You might have personalized conflict, unresolved issues in self, disproportionate intensity, and the conflict is always about me. Whereas if you're in the blue zone, that's where the values are in the conflict. Self-awareness is key. You have proportionate intensity. Conflict is generally solved, and the conflict is always about the mission. And then the 4th piece is stay the course. And that's where he really talks about resilience. How do we and where do we have resilience to really just continue to push forward, no matter how difficult it is, or no matter how much we don't know anything about, the situation that may arise. So conviction, connectedness, calm, and then the course.
Yeah. Where have you seen the need to adapt within your own groups and kind of use this adaptive capacity?
Yeah, we've been asking ourselves a lot lately, like, what is our new measurement? Like, what are our new metrics? How are we measuring engagement right now? Because I can tell you, it isn't how many people are walking through the front doors of a building, right?
Yes.
And what does commitment look like in a season where people are being pulled in every different direction and they're taking on new roles, not only as, maybe mom and dad or mentor in ways that they used to serve before, but now they're homeschooling their kids on top of everything else. And then the other area has been we just are communicating resilience and the foundation of the character of God every single chance that we can to our leaders. We've been saying over and over again. I've been telling myself over and over again, God's got this and God's got you. So despite things that are changing, God never changes.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Well, let's keep moving forward to part 4 of the book that covers relational congruence. I think this one quote really helps set the tone for this section. If leadership is energizing a community of people towards their own transformation in order to accomplish a shared mission in the face of a changing world, then leadership is always relational. It's focused on a community of people who exist to accomplish a shared mission. I mean, is this not what our vision of our own small groups are?
Yeah.
Yes, we have a shared mission, but in order to get there, I want to see each person transformed to become more like Christ. One of the things that you were sharing about when we were going through that change process was stay connected, and you had gotten into the people who, staying connected to people before you. And I think that we understand that, but, could you help us understand the against you? Like, why would we want to stay connected to the people who are against us?
Yeah.
Or what does Todd share of why that would be?
Yeah, absolutely. So he shares about how when you stay close with people who are not for you, you're going to end up dealing with sabotage. That might be a little bit of a dramatic terminology, but he shares a couple of stories where it really did feel like sabotage to him. And he talks about this idea of the people who aren't for you, the people who don't agree with you, which you're going to have as you're encountering change, as you're changing your plans and going from canoeing to figuring out another method to get over the mountains. He calls them dissenters. And he says that according to John Cotter, who again is that change theory expert, he says, engage dissenters, not discourage them. And the reason being is because it talks about this idea of people don't naturally resist change. What they resist is the loss that they experience in change. And it's such a powerful thought to think through, okay, you might not be for me, but maybe it has more to do with the fact that we're changing something that you're now grieving a loss and experiencing that.
Yeah, no, that's even the example that you talk about, like, the centers, it makes me think of, like, what was that, 2008 when BlackBerry, when the iPhone first came out, and you had that. I remember being an iPhone person. I'm kind of an early adopter, and but all my friends, they all had the BlackBerries, and like I specifically remember them just being like, I can't imagine having a phone without a keyboard. And now we look back on that and think about like how kind of silly it is that we were so attached that like we had to have that. And that along the way there's going to be like I love that he talks about like we need to expect that. We need to expect people who are going to resist the change that we're hoping to bring into our organization.
Yeah.
And then he expands into this thing about allies and confidants that I really like, and talking about the difference between the two. So allies, he defines, are people who are within your organizations. They see your goals. They even have others or maybe even competing loyalties. They can give you perspective, can build alliances. But one thing that's important is that they're not friends. I think that's also one of those things that's like, I know personally for me, it's been one of the things that's been challenging working in a church is that, these allies that you think are your friends, but really like that can go south quickly. That's a whole nother podcast. But, and then the other side of it is the confidants, which is people who are usually outside of your organization, see your heart, loyal only to you, give you encouragement, can build you up, and are not partners. And talking about how each of them play their own role and have their own values within that. I think about this a lot because there are people that I've developed really strong friendships out of the small group network, and realizing that they're confidants, knowing that they know my role and they're loyal to me, but they don't necessarily see the day to day. And so I need to be cautious of how much they kind of build me up, right? Because sometimes you can go into it and it's like they don't always see what's going on, or the goals or the church's kind of side of it, like your allies do. So anything that you would kind of add to that, or how you experience that?
Yeah, I think just the distinction that you highlighted is, your allies are not necessarily your friends, whereas your confidants tend to be your friends. The only other thing that I will add in this section that I thought was really powerful is Todd references this nickname of a peacemonger. And he says, like, you really don't want to be a peacemonger, because especially when you're, dealing with sabotage, because people who are a peacemonger, they're overtly anxious risk avoiders. They're more concerned with good feelings than progress, and they consistently prefer the peaceful status quo over the turbulence of change, even if change is necessary.
Yes.
And so, he just was like, you really don't want to be a peacemonger. Maybe someone who's a peacemonger, and then that's when he talks about, making sure that you're engaging with the people who are for you, the people who aren't for you, and then also making sure that you're just continually, okay, am I making this decision to just keep a peaceful status quo, or am I making this decision because this really is what needs to be done, because I'm sticking to the mission, and it will result in change and it will result in loss, but it's the way forward.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. It was just, let's wrap up this book. So part 5 is on transformation. And I really think where he's trying to wrap this up as well is that inside this part as well, he introduces someone else who's very key to Lewis and Clark's success, which is they met up with Sacagawea, and she really was able to help translate and knew the territory already. And he sort of brings in this, like, how we need to include a diversity of thought. And so I'm curious, what does diversity of thought look like within your church?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think one of the things that it really is about is being aware of, like, I don't want to bring another Kiersten to the table. I want someone who thinks differently than me. I want someone who has a different background than me. I want someone who didn't go to seminary. And that way I'm continuing to enlarge the leadership pool, and that there is that diversity of thought, because he says when you have diversity of thought, then you have improved problem solving. And that's one of our greatest prayers at NCC in this season, is we want to be solutionaries. And in order to be solutionaries, not only do we need to be, seeking the Lord and what his will is in this season, but also we need to be bringing many people around the table and inviting them into the process.
That's such a great way to communicate that. I was thinking too in this of how much, like, one of the concepts he kind of talks about in the book too is this, like, seeing things from the balcony and getting out and that as well. But I loved your point on, like, I don't need another Kiersten at the table. And I see this a lot inside our own church, where we have a lot of, sorry, this is another podcast that's going to talk about Enneagrams, but we have a lot of ones in our church. We have a lot of, like, our leadership is made up of a lot of, like, that perfectionist kind of type. And when we go to hire, I think sometimes we look exactly for that, like, same one again, and miss out on the 4s who can really help us, feel and care, and don't have necessarily these huge gut reactions to everything. And so I love that you're talking about, like, bringing in other voices. I think about the two, one of the things that's been helpful for me as well is, like, continuing to look for the next generation as well and bringing them on staff. I think sometimes we get hesitant because we think, like, oh, what do they know? But, like, they give you such a different vision than what you're not typically used to, which I think is good too. Or even just, like, they always find great ways to know how to communicate better and more effectively, since that's constantly changing too. Yeah. All right. As we wrap up, I want to start this new section on this podcast that is kind of like a lightning round. If you want to tweet me or however, if you want to find me on Facebook, I'd love a name for this section, but I'm going to end each show with the same question. So first question is, what's a book that you've read recently that has had an impact on your leadership?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I just finished reading The Vision Driven Leader by Michael Hyatt. Oh, just phenomenal, phenomenal book. I really am on this vision train right now. And so I would highly recommend it because he unpacks, like, not only do you need to have a vision for your organization, but in order to understand a vision, you have to have a personal vision script. And if you don't have one, you need to get one. And then he walks you through the steps of how to have one.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm a big fan of his. Before there was this show, Reading LENZ, we used to have the same format, and it was called Book Talk. And we did his book, Free to Focus, back in March of 2020. And you can hear how I implemented that into how I work as a small group director. And then what's one book that you would say that you're looking forward to that's on your list? You know, I saw recently on your Instagram that you have like 5 books that you're about to tackle.
Yeah, Nick, I think one of my biggest problems is I always have a stack of books that I want to be reading. So I'm working through that stack. And the next one on my list is a book called Compassion and Conviction. It's a basic guide for civic engagement. And so just trying to read right now, we've been encouraged as a staff to read all kinds of books that we naturally gravitate towards, books that we don't naturally gravitate towards, and to really just continue to be learners. And so that's next on my list.
Yeah. It sounds like your church is really embraces personal development. What does that look like at NCC?
Yeah, NCC very much so emphasizes even personal development. So that's everything from continued resources for whether that's books or conferences, whether that's being a part of networks and being in, like even the small group network huddles. That's a huge part of even my personal development that NCC rallies around and says, no, like we want you to be a part of that stuff. And it's a huge blessing.
That's awesome. Kiersten, thank you so much for joining us today. I know that, you're always doing so much for the small group network. So thank you. I'm Nick Lenzi, and I want to thank you for listening with us. Thanks, Kiersten, for sharing your experiences with us. We hope that you enjoyed today's podcast. Reading LENZ will be back next month with Tommy Carrera from Mission Church in Ventura, California. We'll be covering the book Tribe on Homecoming and Belonging by Sebastian Junger. I am looking forward to this one. And then this is the summary. We have a strong instinct to belong to small groups defined by clear purpose and understanding tribes. This tribal connection has largely been lost in a modern society, but regaining it might be the key to our psychological survival. This is awesome because it's not written by like small group pastor. And so like the fact that they're using small groups, I think is really exciting. So I'm looking forward to diving into that book. And, so if you want to join along with us, that's the book that we're going to be reading. But remember, readers are leaders. Take care, everyone.